Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Doug Dahman, the Educational Coordinator at the Civil War Museum in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Welcome to our November installation of the Second Friday Lecture Series. For those of you who've been with us for a long time, you know that every month we feature a different speaker on a Civil War topic. And these programs are either broadcast or hosted at noon on the second Friday of each month. The program has been sponsored since its inception by the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee and the Iron Brigade Association, and so we can't thank them enough for their continued support of these Second Friday lectures. They allow us to bring in speakers from all over the country free of charge for our audiences. And just a note, we're hosting this one obviously today in the virtual realm. As we kind of move forward as a nation, the obvious hope is in the future to be able to host our speakers again at the museum, but we'll continue to broadcast them and video record them for playback on Facebook. So if you're joining us from outside of the Milwaukee, Chicago, Kenosha area, you'll still be able to access these wonderful programs as we move forward to transitioning back to an in-person audience. To that effect, today, we're joined by Larry Desotell, author and historian, and he is going to talk to us about a presentation that he put together entitled Sir Butternut Comes to Madison. Now, Larry lives in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. He retired about 10 years ago from teaching at Arrowhead High School, and much of his presentation today comes from a new book that he has recently published. You can see the picture of the cover there on our screen, The Captured, the Sick, and the Dead. And Larry's presentation today really centers around the story of the Confederate prisoners and the period in which Camp Randall in Madison was used to house them. This is I think one of the lesser known aspects of the state of Wisconsin's role in the Civil War. His purpose today is to discuss and examine the experience of these Confederate soldiers, concentrating specifically on the members of the First Alabama Infantry and the Alabama companies of the First Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi regiments in both the Battle of Island 10 and their experiences in Madison. So Larry, thank you so much for joining us in the virtual realm today, for transitioning and agreeing to do this. It's a pleasure to meet you, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Doug. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Larry Desotell. I wrote this book, as you can see it up here, after getting the idea, after visiting the cemetery in Madison, the section known as Confederate Rest of Forest Hill Cemetery there, right by Madison West High School. And I looked at those grave markers there, and I wondered, what a strange twist of fate for a bunch of Alabama boys to end up in the here in Madison. So I began to do some research, and that research, of course, evolved over time. One person that I want to give a great deal of credit to is a gentleman who I've never met, but I've come in contact with lots of his work, and that's a man by the name of James Heberling. I've tried to contact him, but he basically created the path that I followed. He did a great deal of research that came up with all the names and of the 1,124 prisoners that were kept in Madison, and I am greatly in his debt as a result of that. So part of what I'm doing here is a tribute to him, and I thank him very much. Now, the first thing is, where did these guys really, how did they get here? In a very little known battle, I think, it seems like, and that's the Battle of Island Number 10, which you can see right here. Island Number 10, so named because it was the 10th island from where the Ohio joined the Mississippi River. The Confederates had, basically in 1861, had occupied New Madrid, that you can see up here. They began to build a couple of fortifications, and then they began to fortify Island Number 10 here in this kind of double loop here, as a way to prevent the movement of Union troops south on the Mississippi River. As it turned out, a lot of that strategy, I think, might best be called ill-fated, because as the Confederate position in Columbus, Kentucky collapsed, basically what happened is that it was step by step, all of these fortifications and Confederate positions basically got outflanked, and they were forced further south, and eventually a decision was made to evacuate them and actually use those troops in what became the attack at Shiloh in April. That's one of the reasons why this battle isn't as well known. Island number 10 was captured basically on the 7th and 8th of April, which are the, right around that time of the Battle of Shiloh. So it doesn't get that kind of attention, but as I say, using a term from Ken Burns, whatever that case, for these soldiers who were standing in the Mississippi River, manning these fortifications with the floodwaters, this was their universe of battle. This is where they were. This is what the war was to them at this particular point in their military careers. That's a part of it. Now, who were they? One of the things I wanted to explore was, who were these guys? You see these names on a gray tablet, and you want to find out, I did anyway, want to find out who they were, where they were from, what did they do. And so I began to, investigate. One of the things I wanted to discover was what was their connection, if any, to slavery. And that was part of part of the intent of my research to make that. Well, what I discovered was that most of the guys from the First Alabama were from, and from the First Consolidated, as I call them. The First Consolidated is really the First Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi. As you can see here under that name, that most of them from Alabama were in that strip, in that kind of gold color you see from those counties, stretching from, from the far east of the state all the way across to Choctaw County and Sumter County in the far west. This was really cotton country, particularly as you go further west. And a lot of these western counties were really beginning to grow by the time the Civil War began, and slavery was prevalent there. But that's where most of these guys were from. And I was able to visit in Choctaw and talk to some people at their library and get some information. They were very helpful. It was interesting to go there to see that. Now, again, these are, lies, damn lies, and statistics. But what I want to point out was that these guys were coming from counties, again, that were heavily, heavily dependent on slavery, on a slave economy, more importantly. As you can see, Sumter County there, up on the second one from the top, 78% of the population in Sumter County were slaves. And next in line, if you go down to Wilcox County right here, 72%. Lowndes County, 71% of the population were slaves. And there were, again, another 5 counties that where over half the population were slaves, and producing a great deal of cotton. And I'm just going to move that over. And you can see here these are the bales of cotton that they produced, making people very, very wealthy. This is in 2016 dollars. The amount of cotton produced in the counties that you see on here was $1.655 billion in just those counties in Alabama. So slavery, so the first instance is slavery was important in the counties where these guys were from, but that doesn't really tell us what their connection to slavery is. That is the soldiers of the First Alabama and the First Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi. That you can find a little bit better here. I gotta keep moving this. I don't want to, although you guys probably don't really need to look at me so much, but you know, here's a way to do it. Now, this model is based on a guy by the name of Joseph Glathar, who basically wrote this about the Army of Northern Virginia. And basically what he did was he created three categories. One is owned slaves, another one was family-owned slaves, and a third was either lived with or worked for someone who owned slaves. And I used the census to try to figure this out. And anybody I couldn't find in the census, I just, as a way of coming up with these statistics, I just decided to include them in this body, which is the ones not connected to slavery. If I couldn't find any information on them about slavery, I assumed they were not connected. That was just the methodology I used. So as it turns out, 7% of the First Alabama, the soldiers in the First Alabama owned slaves, 17% came from families that did, and 6% came from living with or working with, you know, particularly like students. I know there were a pair of brothers who from Alabama who lived with a slave owner, a very large slave owner. And my theory was, and this could of course be questioned by intelligent people, is that they were going to be heavily influenced by that. You know, when they sat down at the supper table, I'm sure they weren't talking abolitionist ideas with these guys. So that's the First Alabama. So you can see what that means if you add this up, is that 30% of those from the First Alabama were connected somehow to slavery. It also does not take into account those who didn't own slaves, who may have rented them. And in the book, I go through a little bit of a process of trying to determine who could afford slaves at the time. And there is literature on this, and you know, there were quite a few, and I didn't put this in here because it would be speculating, but there were quite a few who were able, who would have been able to afford maybe perhaps a slave or two slaves during certain times of the year. So that has to be put in. So I guess what I'm getting at is that this is kind of a floor for the connection to slavery. It's not a ceiling. It's a floor. So hopefully that will add to some people's, to our understanding of what the connection to slavery was. The First Consolidated, as you can see, was not quite as connected to slavery as the lads from the First Alabama. 90% were not connected to slavery. 2% did own slaves. 5% came from the families that did, and 3% came from people who lived with or worked with people who owned slaves, but perhaps did not own slaves themselves. So that's 10%. So you got 10% in one regiment, you got 30% in another. If you wanted to average them, you could make an argument that 1 out of 5 soldiers that came from those Alabama units were connected to slavery. And that's what seemed to me to be a lot. Again, I tried to go into this with an open mind. I wanted to find out where the numbers led me, and then I was going to draw conclusions from that. My conclusion was that it means that slavery had something to do with why many of these people joined. And that's developed in my book. And again, you can read that and you can think about that and see what you think. But that's the conclusion that I came to. Now, if you take just those folks that, again, I have to keep moving this around, that are buried at Forest Hill, you get 82% were not, out of the 140 of them, there are 140 graves. 139 of those, as we'll see, died of disease. One died after being shot by one of the guards of the 19th Wisconsin that was there. And you can see here that 1.5% owned slaves. That's actually, I believe, 2 people. 4.5% came from who lived or worked with those people who owned slaves. And then the biggest group, 12% came from families. And you notice that's been the biggest group in all three pie charts. And the reason is that many of these guys were young enough that they did not own their own land. They still lived at home, and their parents owned slaves, which they were at some point, if they believed they were going to inherit. But this is the idea. So yeah, you can see here, two of the 140 owned slaves, 17 came from families, and then 6 lived with folks that did. So that kind of evens out. I mean, it seems like across the board, we're coming up with about that number of about 20%. 1 out of 5 owned slaves. And I'm sure there were others that were missed. But again, this is the floor that you should understand. And so I drew again the conclusion that slavery had a big impact on why people joined, and then also a whole idea of why would you join if you were not connected to slavery? Why would you fight to defend that institution in the Civil War? And notice I believe that was the fundamental cause of the central cause of the Civil War, was the defense of slavery. Again, people can have a view. That's the conclusion that I drew. But this was all before these guys even joined the military. The first Alabama that ended up in Florida and then got sent up to, and they were artillerists. I mean, all these guys that we're seeing were artillerists, even though they joined as infantry. They were able to defend themselves in that regard. All right. Well, now they get captured again. That is the 7th and 8th of April of 1862. They're captured, and a decision has to be made where to send them. The head of the prison system, commissary, general of prisons, was William Hoffman. He wanted to send them to Milwaukee. That was his bureaucratic position. But the decision was fundamentally made by Henry Halleck, who was the head of the Union forces in the West. And he decided that some of them, and they were sent to 3 different prisons, as we'll see. He decided that some should be sent to Camp Randall as the place for them to end up. I'm sure there were folks in Wisconsin that were encouraging that as a way to get in on pork barrel politics and so on, and the money that would come into Madison to tend to these prisoners. But that decision was made. And as it turned out, there were 1,224 soldiers, actually 1,224 people sent to Madison. 10 of them were non-combatants, but the rest were soldiers that were fought there. They were also sent to Camp Douglas in Chicago, and then they were also sent to Camp Butler in Springfield, Illinois. Now, many of the soldiers that came to Wisconsin came on 2 different days. Some came they were taken to Cairo. They then crossed they were then taken by rail to Chicago, spent some time in Camp Douglas, and then went on to Janesville at Fort Crawford, and then were sent to Madison. And they arrived again on April 20th after that time. Then another group came on April 24th. They were sent via steamboat up the Mississippi. They spent some time at Prairie du Chien, and then they were sent by rail to excuse me, you're gonna have to edit that out. They were sent to then they were sent to Madison. The point here is that there was a difference between the two groups. The second group we're going to see were people who were largely, although not 100%, but largely in hospital, in sick when they were captured, and it's going to account for a very high death rate at Madison, as we shall see. But again, there were 1,224 of them who were sent there, and that was 140 of those are going to die. A few escaped, maybe 4 or 5. Some of them on the very first day, evidently, but the death rate is based on the 1,224. So that's part of why or how things work there. Once they got there, you know, the folks in Madison treated them pretty well. They bought them tobacco. They got them paper to write with. They gave them warm clothes. I mean, here are a bunch of boys from Alabama and Tennessee and Louisiana and Mississippi and so on, and Arkansas. And here they are in Wisconsin in April. You know, and a lot of them had been ordered to send their heavier clothing home. So, you know, they were many of them were without shoes. They were without, you know, heavier coats. They had been standing in water. Their clothes were in horrible condition. And both the military officials in Wisconsin and the local population felt bad for them and did all kinds of things to help them out at first. You know, that was quite a sight for them, you know, for people. Some of the Confederates were amazed that now Madison was probably about 8,000 folks at the time. They were amazed at how big the city was. That was, like, for many of them, the biggest group of people they had ever seen in their lives. But they settled in. They played baseball, which was growing in popularity in America. They played euchre. A lot of them were seen playing euchre, and they, you know, many of them read the Bible. They, you know, they found ways to pass the time that they had there in Madison. Some of them were plotting their escapes. Some of them were harboring bad ideas about the Union and about the people. I mean, obviously, you got 1,224 people. You're going to have a variety of different attitudes. You're going to have a variety of different activities that they all would undertake. And at first, there was, again, a relative, you know, a good relationship between the prisoners and even the 19th Wisconsin. Now, the 19th Wisconsin is interesting because it's the only regiment in the state that was formed under the authority of the War Department. It was not formed through the governor. And the governors didn't like it. The governors in Wisconsin didn't like it because then they didn't really have any control over it. They didn't get patronage from being able to name the colonels and some of the other officers. And it was at the time, the 19th had been training at Camp Utley in Racine under its Colonel Horace Sanders, who had formed the regiment. And because they were basically at that time the only regiment left in Wisconsin, they were sent to Camp Randall instead of being originally, as they were supposed to be, sent to the Western Theater. But they remained in Wisconsin, and they became the Guards. And you can imagine, after a while, that duty did not sit well. I mean, these were young men full of ideas about how to achieve glory, who wanted, you know, in many ways join because they wanted to get away from home and to see the country and to, you know, again, find valor in their Civil War efforts. So over time, the relationship began to break down. The Confederate prisoners became more surly. They didn't seem to, you know, they wanted to become problems for them. You know, they would, one of the things that they would do, and this is going to cause the death of one of the soldiers, one of the things they would do is they would not use the assigned sinks to relieve themselves. And when they would go by guards, and they would do that within a very close proximity of the guards. And finally, there was a problem that ended up in one being shot. We'll get to that in a minute. But one of the things that was consistent, that went way beyond attitudes, was the death rate. And fortunately, we're on that slide. We have a diary, letters actually home, written by George Paddock of Company B from Baraboo. And, you know, he says, you know, that he was amazed at the condition of these rebels, almost over 200 of which immediately were sent to the hospital when they arrived. And notice that expression he used, they die off like rotten sheep. And then there was, you know, he talks about how day after day, the list grows, 11 one day, 9 the other, you know. He says it looks hard. And then he was assigned the duty, along with the others, of burying the soldiers. And at first, it was up to the 19th to do that. And as he said, they buried them in individual graves. They created a little wooden marker that would have their name, their company, and their regiment. But eventually that was taken over by a local company called Church and Hawley, that was a furniture maker and a coffin maker. And they got a contract that they would bury the soldiers at $5.50 a body. And again, they got the pine box. You can see all that. The headboard, and again, the company and the regiment and the date of death. The problem with them being put on wooden boards was that, of course, over time, the inscriptions would begin to fade, and it would be hard to keep track of who was who. That was going to be something that was going to be a problem up until about 1909, when the stone markers were put in that are there today. And even still, as if you read the book, you find out there's a lot of question about whether or not the right name is with the right body. That's just part of that was just part of the deal. Well, the death rate continued to rise. It got so bad, or at least the reports in the papers made it seem so bad, that first a guy named Joseph Potter, an assistant quartermaster down in Chicago, came up to visit. He wrote a report that was very condemning of the 19th Wisconsin's treatment of the prisoners. And then William Hoffman himself came. And William Hoffman, my thesis in the book is that William Hoffman had already had in his head a bias against the 19th and against the prison facility in Madison, and it went against where he wanted it to be. And he found great fault as well. There's a quote in which he says, you know, there's no signs of convalescence here. You know, these guys are sick. They're laying on the bare floor. Equipment, particularly wood that was supposed to be used to build facilities for them, has been commandeered by the officers of the 19th for their own use. And one of the things that he mentioned a couple different times is that there was something like 187 bottles of whiskey that had been consumed in the first 2 weeks. It was supposed to be used for medicinal purposes, of course, but somehow managed to find its way to members of the to the 19th. So basically, what Hoffman decided to do was to remove the 19th from the care of the sick prisoners and put them in the hands of a local doctor from Madison by the name of Joseph Hobbins. And if you go to the Wisconsin Historical Society, Hobbins's little notebook in which he lists the names of the dead as they occur, you can find that there. And when you know, for me, when I found that and held that in my hands, that was a very, very strong connection to what was going on there. You know, when it's not just me talking or someone else talking, but actually seeing that artifact. What a great What a great thrill that was for me. That was very, very interesting. So what Hoffman did was, again, to allow a regular Army officer by the name of Major R.S. Smith, who is really the recruiting officer in Madison, in that area, to run the prison. Have now the doctors of the 19th just deal with the 19th soldiers who were sick, and have Hobbins deal with the Confederate soldiers that were sick. And he thought that that was going to make a difference. This lasted from about May 7th or 8th, when this new regime was installed. But then Hoffman made the decision at the end of May to close the prison. So strangely, the Camp Randall as a prison lasted 6 weeks, from May 20th to the very end, from April 20th to the very end of May, which is a very short time. And as one observer noted, he claims that it was the only prison in the North closed for cause. That is, it was closed because the death rate was so high. For the days, even when the prison closed, the prison hospital did not. That stayed open until July, or actually into August of 1862. So for all those days, I believe that is 65 days that the prison hospital was open, the daily death rate was 2.1. So 2 soldiers were dying for every, basically for every day that the prison was open, which was higher than Camp Douglas. It was higher than Camp Butler, and it was higher than most facilities. So I began to wonder why that was. I suppose my badge of pride was wounded at that a bit, but I wanted to figure out why that was. And I created, with the help of some folks, a measurement that took into account these prisons, the different amounts of days that they were open, and the different amount of prisoners that they held. And after doing that, after doing all kinds of calculations, something began to emerge. And one of those was that the death rate was high. Particularly, it was higher for those people who were brought via Prairie du Chien, much higher. And particularly of both who died within the first, say, 2 weeks after they got there, whether that was on April 20th, again, it was, or on April 24th, the numbers came to the conclusion that there was some connection between coming on April 24th and a higher death rate. In fact, if you took out the ones who came on April 24th, which I did in one of the tables in the book, you'd find that the death rate at Camp Randall actually became lower than at Camp Douglas, and with only 0.1% of Camp Butler in Springfield. Before that was done, Camp Randall's was twice as high as both of them. And again, the conclusion I drew was that it was because it was the folks that were sick that were sent there. Now, of course, sick prisoners were sent to the other camps as well. It's also important to note that another 55 was prisoners who were sent to Camp Douglas after the one in Camp Randall was closed. 55 of those died in Camp Douglas. Now, was that because of the conditions at Camp Randall? I suppose you could make a claim it was. But if that's true, then it's also easy to make the claim that part of the reason the death rate in Camp Randall was higher was because of the condition they were in when they got there. In fact, there were a couple of regiments, a couple of companies really, of the First Alabama, whose death rate was higher before they got captured than it was after they got captured. So they actually got you could argue they were better treated in Madison than they were by their own regiments. So it's interesting. Plus, you know, you'd also have to look at the death rate for these guys varied so much for the by regiment. The 55th Tennessee had a very low, less than 0.1% while they were in Madison, but they had the highest number of all the regiments that that died once they were sent back to Camp Douglas. So all those are factors that basically kind of in a sense make us kind of look at the numbers with a certain amount of realization that there are lots of factors that why the death rate there was so high. And that's not to take away from anything. I mean, you know, the base it purely on numbers is kind of dehumanizing, because these were, as the slaves were, as the Union guys were, these were all people with family, with people who loved them. Part of the problem is I think we always forget all that, is we demonize some on all sides, not just that. The other, you know, one of the couple of interesting stories about some of these guys, there was a guy named Clark Lang who claimed that he was from Wisconsin. He and another Confederate prisoner escaped and were trying to make it to his home in Asdalon, which is kind of south and east of Madison. It's not that far. It's about 35 miles, I think, or so. Now he got caught. So I was looking him up. I'm thinking, is there a Confederate soldier here who was from Wisconsin? And I went through a long process looking in the census in 1860 for him from each state, because he was from the First Consolidated, so he could have been from any of the three states that made up the First Consolidated. I finally found him in the 1850 census, and there was a Clark Lang who grew up there, and who was listed as being a Confederate soldier. Now, to me, that's an interesting story. There's got to be some Greek mythology about a man who would grow up in the state of, you know, in a place like the state of Wisconsin, be captured in a war and be brought back there. But as it turned out, he was recaptured by the Lieutenant Colonel Charles Whipple and was returned to Madison. Then they began to investigate how he got out, and they realized that there was a guard from Company H, Amos Carr, who had basically been bribed to let them leave, and he was ready. In fact, it was already in the works that there was another group, in fact, a rather large group, that had bribed him to allow them to escape the next time he was on guard duty. And that was found out, and supposedly he was arrested and tried and was supposed to be executed, but there's no record that he ever was. So we don't really know what happened to him. Let's just say it that way. But that was part of the story. There's another story about you know, who were some of these people. Among the 1,200 or so people in the camp, 5 of them were women. One was, and there were two children. One was the son of one of the captured Confederate prisoners. Bridget Parrish was one of the women. She had gone with her husband to island number 10 with 2 children of theirs, the 2 children, and he died there. She was now under the care of her husband's brother, who and they were brought to Madison. She got very ill, but was taken care of and recovered. And when they asked if she wanted to be released, she said no, she'd rather stay with her brother. And there were other women, one of whom husband died while at Camp Randall. So that's part of the story as well. I think that's it. All kind of is interesting things. Those stories are what to me make it worthwhile. It also seems, and I have evidence of this. I have sources that there was one slave there, a guy by the name of John Wesley, who was the slave of a young E.F. Zell from Choctaw County in Alabama. And this is, again, this is a source that was his, well, they call him, of course, a servant, but it was his slave. His family owned 6 slaves. He owned a couple. He was a young man, but he too owned slaves, and brought him with him. And this young man was captured along with his owner and brought up to Madison. Whatever happened to him, I'm not sure. There's no record of what happened to him. The most interesting story is the confrontation between these 2 men. And I'm going to go to between George Washington Spears. George Washington Spears was from Choctaw County, Alabama. He was the overseer of a very large cotton plantation. Managed to rise up to corporal, as you can see there. He had 2 brothers with him that were also captured at Island Number 10 and brought to Madison. The first brother had died about May 12th of some disease, typhoid or chronic dysentery, or all the other things that ran rampant through the camp. His other brother was sick. His name was Alexander, and went outside to relieve himself. That is to have a bowel movement, and he did that right in front of the gentleman you see on your right, Clarence Wicks. Now, this picture makes him look older. Clarence Wicks was 16 years old at this time, just a young man. And Wicks told this Spears brother to move. He didn't, and so Wicks threw a rock at him and hit him in the head. While this was going on, George W., the brother, came out of his barracks in response and swore at Wicks, and Wicks responded by shooting him dead. They had a court of inquiry, which cleared Wicks of any wrongdoing, and was one of the reasons that I think that the decision was made to close the camp. Although if you look at other camps, there certainly were records of guards shooting prisoners. Now, as it turns out, Wicks re-upped. Actually, when his term of service with the 19th was over, he joined the 36th Wisconsin. They fought at Turner's Farm, which was part of the overland campaign around the time of Cold Harbor. He was wounded. He was taken prisoner, and he died in a Richmond prison camp, most likely in the hospital there, and was buried probably in an unmarked grave, although there is a marker to him in Marquette County where he comes from. But again, to me, that story, there's got to be a story of in Greek mythology of this. I mean, can you imagine also, the grief, it was a bad day. It was a bad month for Mrs. Spears to find out that her 3 sons all had died in Madison. And Mrs. Wicks certainly felt horrible at the news of her son's death. So these are all part of the stories that I think make this kind of interesting. Now that doesn't really matter. A woman came in, a woman from Louisiana. She had basically been moving around. She had married very young to a gentleman in New York City. He died right away. I mean, within days after the marriage. so she ended up moving to Chicago, where she had some family, and then she ended up moving to Madison. She owned she was part of a partner in a hotel on Devil's Lake. She worked in hotels. She finally ended up, as you can see here, in Madison, and saw this burial site for these 140 Confederate prisoners, and she felt for them. And what she decided to do was to begin to take care of it, to weed it, to plant bushes and trees. And 3 times in her lifetime, she replaced the markers, the wooden markers that were there. She replaced the original ones, and then she replaced her own 2 more times before she died. There are 140 Confederate tombstones there, but there's one other marker that's inside the area where the tombstones appear, and that's to Alice Whiting Waterman, who was this woman from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who basically asked only that she be buried next to her boys. But she took care of those things, those tombstones, those markers, and contributed a great deal. You know, there were some who were able to come to Madison and find out what had happened to their loved ones because they realized that she had been active in preserving this facility. 2 other monuments were there. And again, I'm just going to move that down to here. 2 other facilities. The first one was built by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. The one on the right, that was built around 1906, before the tombstones were there, before the modern ones were there, or the stone ones to be more accurate. And you can see it lists the names of the soldiers, some of them which don't match the tombstones because it was dependent on the list they used. There are like 6 different lists of what their names were. Now, when they put that in 1906, and they had another wreath laying ceremony in 1930, it's interesting that the Veterans Association said, you may not fly the Confederate flag. We're not going to allow that. You know, we fought to take that down, and that has no place here. The other monument was much more modern, put in 1977 by Joseph Huggins. A little bit of misinformation on it. Well, it's kind of mixed, but he says that basically there's 140 graves and they were all from the First Alabama, which is interesting because all they had to do is look at the tombstones and realize they were all not from the First Alabama. But there was an elaborate ceremony. They had a minister there who spread holy water on the grave sites, and that lasted till until the controversy began to exist over Confederate monuments in general. It was I went to they have a ceremony there every Memorial Day where they look first at the Union part of the cemetery, and the Confederate rest is just a little bit down from there. And I was struck by the difference in the tenor of those ceremonies. The Union one, they had rousing speeches. They had a young woman singing patriotic songs. When we walked over to Confederate rest there was a lot of upset people. One of the reasons was that the city had decided to take the flagpole out, because from 1977 till 2017, basically, the flying of the Confederate flag, that is the Army of Northern Virginia, was allowed. But after an opinion given by the city attorney, the city removed the flagpole. And when those people who are associated with that got there and they saw it was down, they were mad and heck. In fact, one guy said he told me he was so mad that he couldn't trust himself to give the speech. So they gave a speech, which a gentleman did give the speech rather, and it was sad to me because there was nothing about the people. He spent the whole time trying to prove that these guys, that the war was not about slavery, because none of these guys were connected to slavery, which I've already shown you is not true. There were. But eventually, particularly as a result of, if you remember the shooting of the murder of a bunch of folks at a church in Charleston, South Carolina by Dylan Roof, the city began to move towards getting rid of these. The first one, the one on the left, the one by Huggins, that was removed in 2016. But then came, and they were going to remove the Daughters of the American, of the United Confederacy one as well, but on the same day, but they realized they didn't have the right equipment for it. It was too heavy. So they didn't want to break it. So they waited, and that created an opportunity for those opposed to its removal to organize and to advocate. But eventually, that particular monument was removed as well. So they're both gone now. One of the people who benefited from this was a guy by the name of William Green of the First Alabama, because for the first time since 1909, you can now see his tombstone when you go there, because it was this monument on the right is right up against about 3 monuments, and 2 of them you can kind of see from an angle, but the one of Green in the middle, that's impossible to see. So again, what your opinion on that is up to you. I try to argue in the book that that these monuments are more about us than they were about them, and we look at this more through the prism of current politics than through the politics or even of the attitude towards the Civil War of these people. We're looking at it from where we come from today, and that's why we have such controversy and in many cases such bitterness over these things. So if you go there now, you'd see the brown oak leaves surrounding these tombstones, but it's an interesting place. It's a sobering place. It's a little known aspect of our history. I mean, I don't know. I wonder if you asked even in Madison 100 people, how many of them know there are Confederate prisoners buried there? I speculate as to how many would actually have known that. I mean, I've got good buddies who grew up in Madison, and they didn't know. And these are not, these are guys who've been around the town. So it's an interesting story. It's part of our history of Wisconsin's role in the Civil War, which we can all take great pride in. I mean, Wisconsin contributed a great deal to the Civil War, as you all know. I'm not, providing any new information to anybody or new opinions, but I think it's a great story, and I would hope that perhaps this might interest you enough to kind of check out the book. And here is that information again. And the right thing to do is go to sandbeachpress.com, which is where you can order it. Or you can go on Amazon too, but Sand Beach Press. But I think you might enjoy it. Actually, now I'm also working on a book on the 19th Wisconsin itself, kind of the sequel, if there is such a thing to this. And they're an interesting regiment. Not one, again, that is heavily known. There's really no books on the 19th Wisconsin that I found. Very, very little literature on them. So it is, that's going to be another work. And we'll see how that turns out over the next few years. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. And I know that Doug, I don't know if Doug has some questions for me or comments, but I'd be absolutely happy to take them.
Hi, Larry. Yeah, I was interested in your statistics on the slaveholding population, the slave ownership. There's been a lot of studies lately. Joseph Glathar did a study on the Army of Northern Virginia, and again, he found that 42% of the volunteers of 1861 who volunteered in the Confederacy were 42% more likely to own slaves themselves or live with family members who owned slaves than the general population in the South. And he again, he echoes that by saying, the enlistees rented land from, sold crops to, they continued to work for slaveholders. So the connection doesn't just end by owning them. It's the economic connection that the soldiers had to the institution as well that I think links the Confederate Army to slavery. And I agree with your overall theory that slavery was obviously at the heart of the Civil War and played a massive role in the key role for the secession of those southern states and for the coming of the war.
Yeah, I did read his book on that, and that's what I based my whole system on. And what it kind of shows, and this is what to me, it's like, okay, you can argue the political elites are what led the South, in my judgment, to secession. But that, to me, it's another question as to why would people join the Confederate Army? And the reason, I think what this shows is that because their connection to slavery was so strong, they wanted to protect that. They wanted to protect that because they're talking about their futures. I mean, if I'm a young, let's say I'm an 18-year-old kid from Choctaw, Alabama, and my parents owned slaves, that's my future. That's what I'm going to end up with. So to me, that's all part and parcel of this. And I think that's important. My conclusion in the book is that once we accept that as a culture, as a nation, we can begin to move forward. It's like the first step. It's not the only step. But if we continue as a culture to think that there's some Pew study that said 53% said they didn't think the Civil War had anything to do with slavery. Until we, it's like we're alcoholics. We have to admit we are alcoholics. We have to admit that slavery was the cause, and then we can begin to understand ourselves and begin to realize what we need to do to take the next step to create more equality today. That's the conclusion in the last chapter of the book that I draw. But yeah, Glathar to me was that was a very important part. I was really happy to see that, and all the different connections, as you say, renting slaves, working for guys that owned them, selling stuff to them, all that, how the economy was interconnected with cotton production there at the very core.
I know that you, in the course of your research, you came here to the Civil War Museum and used one of our pieces of our collection, a diary from an individual from the 55th Tennessee. Can you talk a little bit about him and what you found in that particular primary source that we have in our collection?
Right, that was George LeBain from the 55th Tennessee, and he wrote a lot. Unfortunately, there's not much about the time at Camp Randall, but you get a very good picture of what they were going through prior to that. Particularly, he talks a lot about guys getting sick and dying, about part of his regiment being sent to island number 10, wading through the water, knee deep to get to these, fortifications, to get to these artillery emplacements, and how in one particular attack, like 15 of the members of his regiment were wounded by artillery shell from the fleet operated, under the command of Andrew Foote on the Union side. And then he has moments where he talks about, because I'm sure he was thinking this was important too, he talked about one night about how gorgeous the sunset was, and how it was casting its illuminating rays. I mean, it's interesting to read that because we don't write like that anymore. We certainly don't write letters like that anymore, because we basically don't write letters, so much less in that. But you know, I found where he was buried. He survived the war, but was listed as an invalid in the 1870 census, and I believe he died in 1872. And at their I drove down there because I was driving down to the Alabama Department of Archives and History, because they got a lot of stuff on the first Alabama in the Alabama Register. And I did finally find it. And it's a little family cemetery. There's about 6 tombstones there of his family, but it's right next to this huge aluminum, I'll call it factory. This place that's producing aluminum. So to me, it's like, you know, the juxtaposition between this kind of connection to these old markers in an agricultural society against what he fought in the Civil War, which then produced the industrialization that became part and parcel of America. To me, that's ironic. It's paradoxical. But it's interesting to me in doing all this research. When you can kind of get to those kinds of connections, that's what makes it worthwhile and interesting to write about. Hopefully, somebody would enjoy reading about it as well.
Well, it was a thought-provoking presentation. Again, something, as you said in your conclusion, that probably many people in Madison are unaware of. And I hope that we were able to shed a little more light on the existence of this and the experience of these individuals with your presentation today, and that those of not only the prisoners, but also the Wisconsin men who were there at Camp Randall, interacting with them, guarding them, and interacting with the citizens of the city as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, very interesting. Well, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity.
Okay, thank you so much, Larry.
Okay,
look for everyone. Our next program will be in December, and it'll be again hosted on our Facebook page. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you in person in the future. Thanks so much.